I was 35 when I spent a long weekend at the old cabin on my uncle's farm in northwestern Missouri. This was back in late October of 2016, and I remember the dates clearly because I had just quit my job a few weeks earlier. I was burned out and frustrated with how things had turned out. I'd been living in Kansas City, working in warehouse logistics, and I didn't really have much to show for it. No girlfriend, no savings, no future I was proud of. My Uncle Greg had passed away earlier that year, and the farm had gone to my cousin Darren, but the cabin was still standing, unused, untouched, and completely alone on the far end of the acreage. Darren had told me I could use the cabin if I ever wanted to get away for a bit. He didn't care. He didn't really go out there himself, said it creeped him out. I didn't take that seriously. I thought it would be quiet and peaceful. A good place to clear my head for a few days and figure out my next move. Maybe I'd write something, or just sleep and let my thoughts settle. I packed up my pickup truck with some gear, food, and water, and drove out on a Thursday morning. The farm was out in Gentry County. The drive took me about 3 hours. I'd been there a few times before as a kid, but I didn't remember much about it. When I got to the main gate, I called Darren just to let him know I was there and heading to the back field. He didn't answer. I didn't think much of it and kept driving in. The cabin sat near a line of trees at the base of a low hill, probably half a mile from the main house. You had to take an old dirt path past 2 fields and a couple rusted-out tractors. The grass was high and dead-looking, all pale yellow and dry. The whole place smelled like dust, soil, and old hay. I saw no other cars, no signs of life, just a hawk circling way up in the sky and a few cows in the far distance, scattered like black stones across the fields. The cabin was smaller than I remembered. It was made from thick, dark wood that had gone gray from years of sun and weather. It had a tin roof with a slight bend in the middle, like it had started to sag. The front porch was covered in leaves and spiderwebs. A wind chime hung from a corner, barely moving. When I stepped up and unlocked the door with the key Darren gave me, the hinges groaned like an old man waking up from a long nap. Inside, it was dusty and cold, but not terrible. There was a twin-sized bed with a wool blanket, a small table with 2 chairs, and a counter with some shelves. A big brick fireplace took up one wall. There wasn't any plumbing or electricity, just an outhouse out back and a few oil lanterns on the walls. I unpacked my gear, set up a small gas stove on the table, and put a few candles around. The silence felt nice at first, peaceful, like I'd finally stepped out of all the noise in my head. That first day was uneventful. I took a walk around the nearby woods and fields, just getting a feel for the place. I found a dried creek bed about 50 yards behind the cabin and an old barbed wire fence that had mostly collapsed. There were deer tracks and some raccoon prints in the dirt. I saw a small shed deeper in the woods, almost hidden under vines and brush, but I didn't go near it. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, and I figured it probably just had old tools or junk inside. When night fell, the quiet started to feel different, heavier. I could hear every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every tiny scrape or knock. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks, or animals outside moving through the brush. I lit a fire in the fireplace and read a bit by lantern light, but I kept looking up, listening. My ears were searching for something, and I didn't know why. I fell asleep in my clothes, the blanket pulled up to my chin, one of my boots beside the bed just in case. I didn't sleep well. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, just different, like a slow dragging noise. I held my breath and listened, but it stopped. After a while, I convinced myself it might have been a raccoon or an armadillo outside. The next morning was gray and cold. I made instant coffee and sat on the porch for a while. The grass was stiff with frost. I saw what looked like footprints leading up the hill toward the trees, but they didn't go all the way, just a few steps pressed into the frost, then nothing. That unsettled me. It was like someone had started walking and then vanished. But again, I brushed it off. Could have been deer or some weird thaw pattern. I spent the day chopping wood, walking around, and writing some notes. The air had a stillness to it, like the whole world had taken a deep breath and was waiting to exhale. Around 4 p.m., I hiked to the tree line and followed it east for a while. That's when I found the old fence again and something else. A shallow depression in the dirt near the base of a tree, like someone had dug a hole and filled it back in. The dirt was darker there, like it had been disturbed recently. I kicked at it a bit, but it was hard-packed. Probably just an animal digging for food. Still, something about it stuck in my head. I marked the tree with a scratch so I could find it again and walked back before sunset. That night, I felt even more uneasy. I didn't light the fire. I just sat at the table, listening to the sounds outside. At one point, I heard what I thought was breathing, slow and shallow, right outside the wall. I held my breath and leaned forward, waiting. It stopped. When I finally lay down, I kept the lantern on low. My knife was beside the bed. I told myself again and again it was just my mind playing tricks, that the quiet was messing with my senses. But I didn't sleep much. On the third day, things started to change. It was around noon when I noticed that the shed in the woods, the one I'd seen on the first day, looked different. I walked out to it and found the door open. It had definitely been shut before. I stepped inside and saw dust patterns on the floor. Some parts swept clear, others undisturbed, like something had been dragged or moved. In the back corner, there was a wooden crate with a broken lock. Inside were old ropes, a stained tarp, and a heavy metal hook that looked like it belonged in a slaughterhouse. I stood there for a while, staring at that crate. I felt something cold run down the back of my neck, like sweat even though it was near freezing outside. I backed out of the shed and closed the door tight. That afternoon, I packed some of my things. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I wanted to be ready to leave early in the morning. I filled the gas tank in the truck and parked it closer to the cabin, just in case. I made sure the firewood was inside, the doors locked, and my phone was fully charged even though there was no service out there. I didn't eat much that night. Around midnight, I heard it again, the dragging sound. But this time it was closer, right up against the cabin wall. Then a tap, soft, then two more, like someone knocking gently with one finger. I sat up and grabbed the knife, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I turned off the lantern and waited. The knocking stopped, then footsteps, slow, uneven, circling the cabin. I didn't sleep at all. When the sun finally came up, I threw everything in the truck and got ready to go. But as I walked around to check the back of the cabin, I saw something that made my legs go weak. There were boot prints, fresh ones, not mine. They circled the cabin, stopped at the windows, the door, the woodpile. And on the side of the cabin, just above the foundation, was a mark scratched into the wood. A symbol I didn't recognize. It looked like an upside-down triangle with a line through it, carved deep, not drawn. I got in the truck and drove straight out of there without looking back. When I got back to Kansas City, I didn't call Darren. I didn't say anything for a long time. A few weeks later, I looked up the history of the farm. I found an old newspaper archive about a missing man from the early 90s. He'd been a squatter living off-grid in rural Gentry County. No one knew much about him, except that he'd been seen a few times by locals and then vanished. His cabin, if you can call it that, had been found abandoned with strange symbols carved into the walls. They never found his body. I don't know what I stumbled into out there. Maybe someone else had been using that land. Maybe the shed belonged to someone who didn't want company. Maybe I was being watched from the moment I arrived. All I know is what I heard and saw was real. I never went back to that farm. Darren sold the land in 2018. The new owners tore down the cabin, from what I heard. burned it to the ground, and cleared out the woods behind it. Whatever was out there, whatever had been living in that silence, it's gone now. But I still think about that place. Sometimes, when it's late and everything's quiet, I swear I can still hear that dragging sound. It was the summer of 2021, and I was 46 years old when my ex-wife Sarah passed away. We had been divorced for a little over 7 years. No kids, just two people who tried and failed. We didn't talk much after the divorce, just the occasional email about some piece of mail or old shared account. Nothing personal. When I heard she died, it wasn't from anyone close. It was a short message from a mutual acquaintance. Apparently, it was sudden, some kind of stroke in her sleep. She was 43. I didn't feel much at first, maybe a little numb. I think when someone you used to love dies, it's not grief the way people expect. It's more complicated. You remember things that you haven't thought about in years. I remembered her handwriting, the way she used to hum when she cooked, how she always forgot where she put her car keys. Little things. I didn't cry or anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something, like close a door that had been open too long. About a week later, I got a letter from her lawyer. Sarah had left me her old family cabin in Vermont, up near the edge of the Green Mountains. I hadn't thought about that place in years. We used to go there every fall, back when we were still together. It was a small, wooden structure with a metal roof and a creaky front porch, surrounded by trees so thick you could barely see the road from the window. No TV, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception unless you stood on a certain rock near the shed. She'd inherited it from her grandfather, and after we split up, she kept it. I assumed she'd sold it or let it fall apart, but apparently, she'd been keeping it up. The lawyer told me in a follow-up letter that Sarah went there often, more than I realized. There was no one else to give it to, so it was mine now. First, I thought I'd just sell it. But then I started thinking maybe I'd go out there for a couple days, just to check on it, maybe clean it out, see what kind of shape it was in. Say goodbye in my own way. I told myself it would help me move on. I had a week off work and I packed light. Some canned food, bottled water, a flashlight, sleeping bag, that sort of thing. The drive was about 4 hours from where I live in Albany, and the farther I got into the hills, the fewer cars I saw. I pulled up late afternoon on a Friday. The place looked almost exactly like I remembered. A little more worn down, maybe. The paint on the shutters had started peeling, and the steps up to the porch were leaning a bit to the right. But otherwise, it was like time had stopped here. The woods were thick and quiet. No wind, just that heavy, still feeling you get in the summer when the heat just hangs in the air. There was no lock on the door, just the old sliding latch, the kind that wouldn't keep anyone out who really wanted in. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me right away. Wood, dust, and that faint old cabin dampness that never really goes away no matter how many times you air the place out. Inside, everything was still in place. The couch with the plaid cover, the iron stove in the corner, her grandfather's fishing rod mounted on the wall above the mantel. It didn't look like a place someone just used once in a while. It looked lived in. There were clean dishes in the drying rack, a folded quilt on the end of the couch, a pair of worn-out hiking boots by the door. I stood there for a while just looking around, taking it in. I started checking the place more thoroughly. I opened drawers, looked in closets. I found her notebooks. Sarah always used to write things down. Grocery lists, journal entries, bits of poetry she never showed anyone. Most of it was just scribbles, but I could see that she'd been coming up here a lot over the last year or two. I even found a few receipts from a grocery store in town dated only a month before she died. There was something weirdly comforting about being there. It brought back memories, some good, some not. I made a small fire in the stove and heated up a can of beans. I ate sitting on the porch, listening to the crickets. When it got dark, it got really dark. No streetlights, no houses nearby, no moon that night. Just pitch black, broken only by the occasional flicker of firelight coming through the window. I should have left the next morning, but I didn't. I told myself one more night, just one. The cabin was quiet, peaceful, felt like a break from everything. The second night, something felt different. I couldn't explain it exactly. It started when I went to take a piss out behind the cabin. I stood there, staring into the woods, and for a moment I felt like something was looking back at me. Not a noise, not a shadow, just this sharp sense of being watched. I shook it off. Probably just my imagination. Maybe a deer or raccoon. I went back inside, locked the door, and got into the sleeping bag on the couch. I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing these small sounds. Not loud, not banging or crashing, just soft little creaks, like a footstep on old wood. But they were never close, just faint. I'd sit up and listen, heart beating faster than it should, and then there'd be nothing, just the fire dying out and the sound of the woods. At some point in the early morning, I thought I heard something out on the porch, a soft scuff like a boot on the step. I sat there in the dark, holding my flashlight, listening so hard my ears started to ring. But again, nothing. The next day, I checked around outside. No footprints, no broken branches, just the damp ground and the trees swaying in a wind I hadn't noticed the day before. I told myself I was being stupid. I even laughed at myself a little. Cabin in the woods, alone. Of course, my brain was playing tricks on me, but I still didn't leave. Instead, I went into town for a bit, bought some fresh batteries, a thermos of coffee, and filled up on gas just in case. When I got back, I walked the property. There was a trail out back Sarah and I used to walk together. I followed it maybe a half mile until I found the old bench we'd built out of logs. It was still there, though part of it had collapsed. I sat for a while, looking at the woods, thinking about her, thinking about us. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The front door was cracked open. I knew I had latched it. I'm not careless about that kind of thing. Not out here. I stood at the edge of the porch for a long time, just staring at that gap. My backpack was still inside. So were my car keys. I stepped in, slow, heart pounding, and looked around. Nothing seemed touched. Everything where I'd left it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The air felt colder, heavier, like someone had just been here. I did a full sweep. Under the bed, behind the couch, even inside the cabinets. Nothing. I told myself maybe the wind blew the door open. Maybe I didn't latch it as tight as I thought. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I stayed that night because I didn't want to leave in fear. I didn't want to let paranoia chase me away from something that had once felt important. So I locked the door. I pushed the dresser in front of it. I closed all the windows and kept the flashlight right next to me. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It was faint but steady, a dragging noise from the back of the cabin, near the shed. I didn't move, just listened. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I got up and went to the window, but the glass was fogged and I couldn't see anything. I stood there for a long time, heart hammering, waiting to hear it again. But it was quiet, dead quiet. I didn't sleep after that. In the morning, I walked to the shed. The door was slightly open, same as the cabin had been. Inside, everything looked normal. Old tools, a coil of rope, a gas can. But when I stepped in farther, I saw something in the corner. It was a pile of clothes, not just tossed there, folded, carefully, like someone had been staying here. And on top, a small black notebook. Not Sarah's. I opened it. There were pages of tight, messy writing. Some of it was journal entries, but they weren't hers. They were someone else's. A man, judging by the handwriting and the way he referred to himself. The entries weren't dated, but they talked about her. Sarah. He wrote about watching her, waiting for her. She comes alone now. She walks the trail. She brings food. She doesn't know I'm here. The last page chilled me. I think she sees me now. She changed the locks, moved the boots inside. But I know the way. I always know. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I closed the notebook and walked out of the shed, heart racing. Suddenly it made sense. The noises, the open door, the strange feeling. Someone had been living out here. Maybe still was. Watching her. Maybe he was here the night she died. I grabbed my stuff. I didn't even pack it neatly. Just stuffed everything into the bag, grabbed the keys, and got the hell out. I didn't even lock the door behind me. I didn't care. I drove all the way back to Albany without stopping. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. I called the sheriff's office up near the cabin and told them everything. I didn't leave my name, just reported it anonymously. They probably thought I was crazy. A few weeks later, I got another letter from Sarah's lawyer. Turns out she had started the process of selling the cabin before she died. There were emails, records of contact with a local real estate agent. But she stopped replying a few months before her death. I wonder now if she knew, if she felt what I felt. I still have the cabin. I've never been back. I don't think I ever will. Some doors don't need to be closed, they need to stay shut forever. And I'm fine with that. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a break from work. I had been feeling burned out, spending too many late nights staring at a computer screen in my apartment in Tulsa. My sleep was trash, my appetite was worse, and I hadn't taken a real vacation in over 3 years. My dog, Scout, a 5-year-old black Labrador mix, had probably been feeling it too. He always had this energy in him, always ready to go out and run. But lately, he just sat by the door and looked at me, waiting. I figured we both needed to get out of the city for a bit. So I rented a cabin up in a quiet part of southern Missouri, not too far from the Arkansas border. I found it on some local listing site, not a big rental company. It looked simple: wooden walls, 1 bedroom, small kitchen, surrounded by forest. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, but it had running water, electricity, and was supposedly pet-friendly. That's all I needed. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going. Just told a friend I'd be off the grid for a few days. The drive was long, about 5 hours through mostly back roads. The last 20 miles were especially rough. Narrow gravel roads, barely maintained, full of turns and potholes. I started to wonder if the listing had been a scam, but then I saw the cabin. It was small and rough-looking, set about 50 yards off the road, almost hidden behind a thick patch of oak trees. There was a little wooden porch, a fire pit made from rocks, and not much else around.
No neighbors.
Just woods stretching in every direction. I parked the truck and let Scout out. He ran around right away, sniffing trees and circling the place like it was his. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled a bit musty but clean enough. Wooden floors, old furniture, a wood stove in the corner, and a single ceiling fan slowly turning overhead. The bedroom was small but decent. 1 bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out onto the trees. The bathroom was attached with a surprisingly decent shower and a composting toilet. I didn't do much that first day. I unpacked, walked around the area with Scout, and made a quick dinner. As night came on, it got dark. Really dark. No streetlights, no glow from nearby houses, just pitch-black woods and the quiet sounds of insects. I made a small fire outside and sat with Scout. He laid next to me while I watched the flames. Sometime past midnight, I went inside and locked the door. Scout curled up by the bed. I laid down, listening to the woods through the open window, Crickets, owls, some distant rustling. I was used to city sounds. Cars, sirens, people yelling, so this was almost too quiet. But I liked it. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The next day, I woke up early, made coffee, and we hiked out along a trail I'd noticed behind the cabin. It wasn't a marked trail, just a faint path in the leaves, but I followed it for a while, Scout leading the way. After about 45 minutes, we came to a wide clearing with overgrown grass and an old wooden bench, half rotted. Nearby, I spotted something odd. An old, rusted rail line cutting through the woods. It wasn't active anymore, clearly abandoned. The metal was rusted, and some of the wooden ties were missing or broken. It ran off into the woods in both directions, mostly straight. Scout sniffed around, tail wagging like crazy. I stood on the tracks and looked down them. I don't know why, but it made me uneasy. Something about how straight and silent they were. I couldn't hear anything but the breeze and a few birds. We headed back to the cabin after that. That night I read a bit, cooked some dinner, and sat outside again. Scout stayed close to me more than usual. At one point he sat up and stared into the woods. His ears were perked up, and he let out a low growl. I looked where he was looking but didn't see anything, just black trees. I called him back and we went inside. He kept pacing for a while, walking to the window and sniffing near the door. I figured maybe there was a raccoon or something nearby. Still, I checked that all the windows were locked and left a flashlight by the bed. The next morning, I found something weird. Near the edge of the porch in the dirt were what looked like boot prints. Deep ones, like someone had been standing there during the night. I didn't remember seeing them before. I knelt down and looked closer. There were two sets of prints. One pair facing the cabin, the other heading back into the woods. I stood there for a long time, Scout sniffing near me. He looked a little tense. I told myself they were probably mine. Maybe from when I unloaded the truck or walked around. But they didn't look like my boots. They were narrower. I even checked the soles of my boots and didn't see the same tread pattern. Mine had thick rubber ridges. These were flatter, more worn down. I tried not to think about it. Later that day, I decided to follow the tracks again. Not the boot prints, those had disappeared into the leaves, but the old railway line. I figured maybe it led somewhere interesting. I packed a backpack, grabbed a knife just in case, and set out with Scout. We followed the tracks south this time. After about a mile, I noticed broken trees and some trash. Beer cans, an old tire, some torn fabric caught on a branch. It looked like someone had camped out there before. Not recently, though. Everything was weathered and overgrown. We walked another mile. The tracks eventually passed over a small stream on a half-rotted wooden bridge. I crossed carefully, Scout following close. On the other side was a kind of clearing where the forest pulled back a little. And there, just off to the left, was an old shack. It looked like it had been there for decades. Tilted, rotting, missing half its roof. There were rusty tools on the ground, a busted lantern, and what looked like animal bones scattered in the grass. I didn't like the look of it. Scout wouldn't go near the shack. He stood stiff, staring at it, tail down, and let out a deep, nervous whine. That's when I heard it. Metal clinking inside. Not loud, just a soft, shifting sound, like something brushing against tin or chain. I froze. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or even a bear, but the air felt wrong, heavy, like something was watching. I grabbed Scout's collar and slowly backed away. The sound stopped. Total silence again. Not even birds. We walked back faster than we came. That night, I didn't light a fire. I locked the doors, windows, pulled the curtains, and kept a flashlight and knife next to the bed. Scout wouldn't leave my side. I heard something again around 2 a.m. A soft, steady tapping like metal on wood. Not fast.
Just top, pass, top.
I held my breath and sat up in bed. The tapping stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I found more boot prints, this time behind the cabin. Same tread, same depth, and they circled the place once, like someone had walked around it during the night. I felt sick. My hands were shaking a little when I picked up Scout's leash. I packed everything. Took maybe 20 minutes total. I tossed everything into the truck bed. Didn't even fold my clothes. Scout jumped in fast, tail between his legs. As I slammed the door and started the engine, I noticed something in the rearview mirror. Someone was standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. They weren't moving, just standing there. I couldn't make out their face. Too far, too many shadows, but I saw a shape, tall, wearing what looked like a dark coat or long shirt. They didn't wave, didn't shout, just watched. I backed out, turned around, and drove down that dirt road as fast as I could without busting my tires. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. From there, it was 4 hours straight back to Tulsa. Scout didn't settle down until we were almost home. He kept looking out the windows like he expected something to be following. I never reported it. Never called the owner of the cabin or asked for a refund. I didn't care. I blocked the listing website. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time. Just said the cabin gave me the creeps and I left early. But I know what I saw. I know those weren't my footprints. And I know someone was out there walking those woods at night, watching the cabin, maybe watching me. Sometimes I still dream about those tracks. The way they disappeared into the trees. The silence that came out of nowhere. That old shack with bones in the grass. The tapping. Scout's older now, moves a little slower. But anytime he hears metal, like a gate or even pots clanking, he growls. Every time. I don't go into the woods much anymore. Not alone. Not overnight. Not since then. Strange. The world is full of things that don't need to be supernatural to scare you. Some of the worst things walk on 2 legs, live off the grid, and don't care if anyone ever hears from you again. I got lucky. I left. I came home. Scout's still here. That's enough for me. It was the fall of 1982 when I decided to leave behind the city for a while. My name's Jim. I was 34 then, and I had spent years working as a woodsman and logger in northern Vermont. The forest was my home, my life. But after a tough few months, losing my job at the sawmill, the breakup with my girlfriend, and a sense that I was stuck in a loop, I thought I'd take some time alone in the woods, somewhere deep and quiet, to clear my head. I found a small, old cabin about 15 miles north of Barre, Vermont, near the edge of the Green Mountain National Forest. It was a simple place, wooden walls weathered by years of wind and snow, a stone fireplace, a creaky wooden floor, and a single window overlooking a thick patch of pine trees. The cabin had been used by a woodsman before me, but it was empty for a few years. The owner, a man named Old Frank, sold it to me cheap, just wanting someone to take care of the place. I didn't want much, just shelter and silence. When I first arrived in early October, the air was crisp, and the scent of pine was everywhere. The road leading to the cabin was rough and narrow, winding through dense woods. I drove my old pickup truck as far as I could, then hauled my gear the rest of the way by foot. My pack was heavy, filled with supplies. Canned food, an axe, a hunting rifle, matches, a small pile of firewood, and a few personal items. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked most of the daylight by late afternoon. I felt at peace just looking around. No cars, no people, only the distant sound of a creek trickling somewhere behind the trees. The first few days passed quietly. I chopped wood, fixed the leaky roof, and cleaned the place. I made fire every night to keep the chill out. I kept the rifle close, mostly out of habit, knowing that bears or mountain lions lived in the area. At night, the woods were alive with sounds. Owl calls, rustling branches, and the low howl of wind through the trees. But nothing ever got too close. Then, on the sixth day, things started to change. That afternoon, I was out gathering firewood about 100 yards from the cabin when I noticed something odd on the ground near a fallen tree. At first, I thought it was just a pile of leaves or maybe a patch of mud. But as I got closer, I saw it was a circle of stones arranged carefully in a rough ring, about 3 feet across. Inside the circle, there were fresh scratch marks on the dirt, like something large had clawed at the earth. I paused and scanned the woods. The sky was gray, and the wind had picked up, shaking the pine needles overhead. I didn't like the feeling of being watched, but I told myself it was probably just an animal marking its territory. Still, I took a mental note to be more careful. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door and sat near the fireplace. I kept my rifle on my lap and stared into the flickering flames. That night, the wind howled louder than before, rattling the cabin walls. Somewhere outside, I heard branches snapping, but I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. The next day, I went into the woods earlier to hunt some rabbits for food. I stayed low, moving quietly, trying to blend into the shadows. I was about a mile from the cabin, near a small clearing, when I found fresh tracks in the mud, huge footprints, bigger than a man's, but with a shape I didn't recognize. The prints were deep and spaced far apart, like something heavy and fast had passed through recently. I followed the tracks for a while, pushing through the thick underbrush, but they disappeared near a small ridge. I felt uneasy and decided to head back. The forest was too quiet for my liking, the kind of silence that makes every step echo too loudly. Back at the cabin, I made sure the windows were locked tight. The sun was setting, and the shadows stretched long. As I sat down to eat, I heard a faint tapping noise outside, like someone or something lightly hitting the wooden walls. I grabbed my rifle and went outside, scanning the darkening forest. The tapping stopped. Nothing moved except the trees swaying in the wind. I shook my head, feeling my heart race. Maybe it was just a branch knocking against the cabin. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump. The wind kept changing direction, carrying sounds from all over the forest. At one point, I thought I heard a low growl outside, but when I opened the door with my flashlight, nothing was there. The days following were tense. Every time I went outside, I felt eyes on me. I heard footsteps in the brush, far enough away not to see clearly, but close enough to know someone or something was there. I found more strange things around the cabin. Broken twigs in a path that led into the woods, fresh claw marks on the trees near the cabin, and a handful of feathers, black and shiny, scattered on the porch. I had lived in the woods before, but this was different. There was no natural explanation. No animal I knew made those prints or left those marks. I didn't believe in ghosts or monsters, but something didn't sit right. One evening, just before dark, I heard a loud crash in the woods to the east. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight and went out to investigate. The forest was dense, but I could see that a large tree had been snapped about halfway up, lying across the ground with branches twisted. The break looked fresh, probably caused by something big, maybe a bear or a storm. But what caught my eye was the smell, an overwhelming stench of something rotten, like decay mixed with smoke. It was foul and heavy in the air. I scanned the area but saw no signs of animals or people. I decided to head back to the cabin quickly. As I walked, the forest grew darker, the canopy thickening above me. My footsteps seemed louder, and every shadow looked like it moved. By the time I reached the cabin, I was sweating despite the cold air. I locked all the doors and windows and piled wood in front of the entrance as an extra barrier. I sat near the fireplace with my rifle, ready for anything. That night, the wind was brutal. It slammed against the cabin walls like a battering ram. Around midnight, I heard loud banging on the cabin door. Thud, thud, thud. Someone or something was trying to get in. I stayed quiet and still, gripping the rifle tightly. The banging stopped after a minute, but then there was scratching on the door, sharp and desperate. I raised the rifle, ready to fire if needed. The noises stopped abruptly, then silence. I waited hours, listening for anything else, but nothing came. The next morning, I found claw marks deep into the wooden door. The pile of wood I had stacked was scattered, as if thrown aside with force. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin much longer. Whoever or whatever was out there, it was getting bolder. I packed my gear quickly, taking only essentials. Before I left, I burned the pile of wood that had been thrown aside, hoping the smoke might keep something away. I walked back down the trail toward the road, keeping my rifle ready. The forest seemed alive with eyes, watching me as I moved. I didn't look back until I reached my truck. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat for a long moment, heart still pounding. The woods had been my refuge, but now they felt like a trap. As I drove away, the trees disappeared behind me, and the sounds of the forest faded. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I learned from a local that many people in the area had heard strange noises and seen odd tracks in the forest for years. Some thought it was a bear or mountain lion, but the footprints were too big and the scratches too deep. I never found out exactly what was out there, and I don't know if I want to. Sometimes it's better not to know. What I do know is that the woods can hold dangers far beyond what you expect. Things that don't care about your stories or your reason for being there. They wait silently, watching, testing. That cabin is still there, standing among the pines, a silent witness to the nights I spent fighting for my life against something I never saw. And for me, that's enough. I'm a park ranger for the Lincoln National Forest, down in southern New Mexico. It was 2003 when I took the job, after years of working odd gigs and trying to find something steady. The Forest Service offered me a small ranger cabin for the summer months. Isolated, out in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but pine trees and mountains for miles. Perfect place for someone like me who wanted to get away from the city noise and just be alone with nature. The cabin was old, built back in the 50s, but sturdy. It stood on a little clearing surrounded by dense pine and juniper. The dirt road leading up to it was barely a track. More like a trail, really. Only rangers and a handful of hunters ever made it that far. The nearest town was Carrizozo, about 40 miles away. If anything went wrong, help wasn't coming fast. I arrived at the cabin mid-May, just as the wildflowers started to bloom and the air smelled fresh from recent rains. I was 28 then, healthy, fit, and ready to spend the summer monitoring trails, checking for fires, and keeping an eye on wildlife. The job was simple but demanding: long hikes, regular patrols, and sometimes fixing things like fences or trail markers. The first few weeks were quiet, almost too quiet. Days passed with nothing but bird calls and the rustle of leaves. I kept the cabin clean and organized, cooked simple meals over the small propane stove, and spent evenings reading old ranger manuals or scribbling notes in my logbook. I didn't mind the silence. It was the kind of peace city folks dream of. One night, about halfway through June, I noticed something strange while patrolling near a remote trailhead a few miles from the cabin. The moon was low, casting long shadows through the trees. My flashlight cut through the dark, and I caught the faint glint of something metallic against the underbrush. Curious, I moved closer. It was a rusted, broken rifle, half buried in dirt and pine needles. Not something I expected to find just lying around. I checked the area carefully. No signs of recent human activity, but some fresh footprints in the soft soil. They looked big, heavy, like boots from a man. Someone had been here recently, maybe even earlier that day. I took pictures with my camera, logged the coordinates, and reported it in my daily check-in with the Forest Service. They said they'd send a team to collect it next week. That night, I felt uneasy, not scared, but like something wasn't quite right. The next few days, things got stranger. I heard noises at night, distant snapping branches, low growls that could have been coyotes or maybe something bigger. The radio sometimes crackled with static even though the weather was clear. My supplies were untouched, but I found a few of my trail markers had been moved or damaged. I chalked it up to animals or wind at first, but one afternoon, while out hiking near a ridge, I spotted a figure watching me from a distance. He was wearing a faded jacket and a baseball cap, standing still, blending into the trees. When I noticed him, he vanished quickly, disappearing into the woods like a shadow. I didn't report the sighting right away. I wasn't sure if I imagined it or if it was some hunter or hiker who shouldn't be there. The Forest Service frowned on trespassers, especially in restricted areas during fire season. Days passed. The tension in the air grew thicker. Then, on a morning patrol, I found fresh tire tracks leading off the dirt road toward an old, abandoned mine entrance, a place off-limits to everyone. The tracks were large, from a truck or an ATV, and recent, maybe hours old. Someone was using the area as a hideout or for something illegal. I took photos again and called the ranger station. They said they'd dispatch a team, but it could take a day or two. I was the only one there until then. That night, I sat on the porch with my flashlight, watching the tree lean. The forest felt different, more alive and threatening. Every rustle made me jump. Then, a few hundred yards away, I saw a faint glow from the mine entrance. Someone had built a small fire. I debated my options. I wasn't armed beyond my standard gear. A knife, a first aid kit, and my radio. I was trained to be cautious to avoid confrontations. But I also knew I couldn't just wait and do nothing if someone was trespassing in such a dangerous area. I grabbed my jacket, slipped on my boots, and headed toward the fire. The trees swallowed me up quickly, their shadows thick and deep. My heart hammered, my breath visible in the cool night air. When I reached the mine entrance, the fire was still burning low. There were empty cans, a makeshift bed of pine needles, and fresh footprints everywhere. No sign of people, but I wasn't alone. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a branch snapping underfoot. I whipped around, shining my flashlight. A man stepped out from the trees, tall, rough-looking, eyes sharp and wary. He wasn't a hunter or a hiker. He had that wild look in his eye, someone used to living off the land, maybe on the run. We stared at each other, both unsure what would happen next. I raised my hands slowly, showing I meant no harm. He spoke nothing, just turned and vanished into the woods, leaving me alone by the dying fire. I reported everything to the Forest Service the next morning. They sent a team to investigate. They found evidence of illegal mining and camping, and a few stolen items from a nearby ranger station. The man was likely a fugitive hiding out in the forest. By the end of July, my shift was over. The cabin felt different when I left, quieter, but heavier. I packed up my gear and drove back down the dirt road, the forest slowly swallowing the tracks behind me. I never saw the man again, but I often thought about those nights, the silence, the shadows, and how close I came to facing someone who lived by different rules. Being a ranger wasn't just about the trees and trails. It was about the people you might never see, the secrets hidden deep in the wilderness, and the quiet weight of responsibility when no one else is around. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It was deep in the woods of northern Maine, close to the Canadian border. The year was 2004, late October. I was 26, freshly out of college, and burned out from the city life of Boston. I wanted a break, Just me, nature, and some time to clear my head. No internet, no distractions, no noise except the wind and the trees. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who rarely visited it himself. It was supposed to be the perfect place to get away. The drive up there was long and lonely. The highway ended about 20 miles from the cabin, and then I took a dirt road that disappeared among the tall pines and birch trees. As I got closer, the road got worse. Patches of mud, deep ruts, and fallen branches. My old Jeep groaned and rattled as I pushed it through. When I finally saw the cabin through the thinning trees, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting a weak orange light through the branches. The cabin was a small, simple structure, made of rough pine logs, with a rusty tin roof and a stone chimney that had seen better days. The windows were covered in a film of grime and spider webs. There was a small porch with a broken railing, and an old wooden rocking chair sat tipped over near the door. The whole place had the smell of wet earth, moss, and decaying leaves. I parked the Jeep near a pile of chopped wood stacked next to the cabin and stepped out into the crisp, cold air. The wind was starting to pick up, blowing through the trees with a low, mournful whistle. I carried my pack inside, shutting the door behind me and locking it with the old iron latch. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled like damp wood and dust. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a bunk bed shoved against the far wall. A couple of lanterns hung from hooks, and a crate held some canned food and a few old tools. It was basic, but it would do. I got the stove going first. The wood was damp and reluctant to catch fire, but after some patient coaxing with newspaper and kindling, the stove began to glow orange. The warmth spread quickly, making the cabin feel less like a forgotten shack and more like a home. I unpacked my gear: a sleeping bag, some clothes, canned beans, and a small first aid kit. I planned to spend a week there, alone, hiking during the days and reading or writing at night. I had my old camera too, hoping to get some pictures of the wildlife. That first night, I slept fitfully. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin and rattling the windows. Every creak and pop made me jump a little. I kept hearing noises outside: twigs snapping, branches scraping, the occasional thud. I told myself it was just animals moving around, deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, I stayed alert. The next day, I woke early. The sky was a pale gray, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of frost. I ate some oatmeal and coffee I had brought with me, then put on my hiking boots and jacket. The forest around the cabin was dense and dark, with towering evergreens and tangled underbrush. I followed a narrow trail that twisted uphill, stepping carefully over roots and stones. The air was cold and sharp, and I could see my breath as I moved. As I walked deeper into the woods, I noticed signs of animals. Fresh tracks in the mud, broken branches where something had pushed through, and scattered pine cones crushed underfoot. I tried to stay quiet, listening for birds or rustling. The silence was thick, almost heavy. By midday, I reached a small clearing where a frozen creek trickled under a thin sheet of ice. I took some photos, feeling a strange mix of awe and unease. The woods were beautiful, but they also felt alive in a way that was hard to explain. Like they were watching me. I headed back to the cabin before dark. The sun was slipping behind the trees, and the temperature dropped quickly. I chopped some wood and fed the stove, then cooked a simple meal of beans and rice. That night, the noises outside were louder. I heard something heavy moving just beyond the cabin, something that didn't sound like a deer or a bear. It was slow, deliberate. The wind howled, and the trees groaned. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was nothing, but as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps. I froze, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped, and the silence stretched out. I waited for what felt like forever. Then the footsteps moved away. I never saw anyone, but that night I didn't sleep much. The following days passed in a blur of hiking, chopping wood, and trying to keep my nerves steady. The cabin felt more and more isolated as the weather worsened. It rained hard one day, turning the dirt road into a slick mess. I was glad I had a four-wheel drive Jeep, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Sometimes I caught glimpses of movement through the trees, a flash of dark clothing, a shadow slipping behind a trunk. When I called out, there was no answer. The woods were empty. On the fourth day, I decided to explore further. I packed some food, my camera, and a flashlight, and headed east along an old logging trail I had found on a map. The trail was rough and overgrown, but I made good time at first. As the afternoon sun dipped low, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. The trail ended abruptly at a swampy area filled with dead trees and thick mud. I backtracked slowly, trying to remember the turns I had taken. That's when I heard the voice. Not a ghost or anything strange, but a man's voice, low and muffled. It was coming from deeper in the woods. I froze, my heart racing. The voice said something I couldn't make out, like a warning or a shout. The sound didn't feel right. It was angry, tense. I didn't respond. I turned and hurried back the way I came. When I got back to the cabin, the door was slightly ajar. My blood ran cold. I was sure I had locked it that morning. I pushed the door open and scanned the inside. Nothing was missing, but the place felt different, like someone had been there. My pack was moved. A chair was knocked over. I searched the cabin carefully, checking every corner and behind the curtains. No sign of anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. That night, I slept with a knife under my pillow and kept the stove fire burning all night. The footsteps returned, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. I stayed awake, listening, trying not to panic. On the fifth day, I decided I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly, ready to leave at first light. The road was still muddy and slippery, but I managed to get the Jeep started and drive out. As I drove down the dirt road, I saw something that made my stomach twist. Near the edge of the trees, someone was standing, watching me. The figure was a man, wearing dark clothes and a hood. His face was hidden in shadow. He didn't move as I passed. I looked in the rearview mirror, but he disappeared into the woods. Back on the highway, I felt relief wash over me. I called my uncle and told him about what had happened. He wasn't surprised. "Those woods have always been dangerous," he said quietly. "People come and go, but some don't leave. You did the right thing." I never went back to that cabin. The experience stayed with me for years. The cold nights, the feeling of being watched, the footsteps outside my window. Sometimes I still hear that voice, low and angry, calling out from the trees. But I learned to trust my instincts. When the woods whisper danger, it's best to listen. It was early October 2017 when I decided to start building a small off-grid cabin on a piece of land I had bought in Arkansas, near the Ouachita Mountains. I was 33 back then, and I had grown tired of the constant noise and pressure that came with living in Little Rock. I wanted quiet, something permanent but disconnected. I wanted something that could be mine, not just rented square footage in some apartment block where you could hear the neighbors breathe through the walls. The land I bought wasn't anything fancy. 10 acres of mixed pine and hardwood forest with a small stream that cut through one side and a dirt access road that was almost completely overgrown. I had to clear that by hand the first weekend just to get my old pickup onto the property. No utilities, no cell service, nothing but trees and hills. Exactly what I wanted. I had planned everything out in my head for months. Watching videos online, sketching diagrams in a notebook, collecting reclaimed wood from demolition sites around the state. I'd drive around during weekends grabbing 2x4s, old windows, insulation that wasn't rotted, anything I could use. It wasn't going to be a palace, Just a single-room structure, maybe 14 by 14 feet, big enough for a cot, a wood stove, and a small desk. I wasn't building it for anyone else. It was just for me. The first time I spent the night out there, I didn't have a roof over my head. Just a tarp strung between trees and a sleeping bag on a raised platform made from pallets. The air was cool that night and full of the smell of pine needles and wet earth. It was peaceful until about 2 a.m. when coyotes started yipping nearby. I didn't sleep much after that, just listened and waited for the sun to come up. Over the next 3 weekends, I got the floor joists in and started framing the walls. It wasn't fast work. I was doing it all by myself, lifting, sawing, hammering, hauling, and I could only work Saturdays and Sundays. I'd drive out Friday evening, park the truck behind a line of trees, and sleep there until dawn. Then I'd start working with a small toolkit and some lunch meat in a cooler. I brought a water can and boiled what I got from the stream if I needed more. It was on the 4th weekend, mid-October, right when the rain started coming more often, that things shifted. I hadn't paid much attention to the forecast that Friday. Just grabbed my gear and headed out after work. The sky was cloudy, and the air smelled like ozone. I remember thinking maybe I'd just get a light drizzle. That's usually all it ever was. By the time I got there, it was pitch dark. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the tree canopy above made it even darker. I had a flashlight and a small headlamp, but both were cheap, and the batteries weren't new. I parked the truck under a big oak like always and walked 20 yards into the clearing where the cabin frame stood. 4 walls, barely knee-high, nailed together but no roof yet. I had brought a roll of plastic sheeting and some heavy-duty garbage bags. The plan was to cover the top and maybe sleep inside the skeleton of the structure that night instead of the tarp. I figured it would be more windproof that way. As soon as I got the plastic half secured, the rain started. Not just a sprinkle, real steady rain. Cold, with wind behind it. The kind that hits your jacket and rolls down into your boots no matter how you move. I rushed to finish pinning the corners with bricks and leftover planks, then crawled underneath. It was still just dirt inside, no floor panels yet, and the water started to puddle almost immediately. I laid out my sleeping pad and bag on top of a couple flattened trash bags, hoping that it'd keep the moisture out. My shoulders and arms were already wet from the rain. It was colder than I expected, and I could hear the wind moving through the trees like a low growl. It wasn't comforting. I must have dozed off around midnight. My phone had died earlier, no signal out here anyway, so I had no way to check the time. All I remember is waking up in total darkness to the sound of something snapping outside. It wasn't thunder. It was sharp and close, like a dry stick breaking under pressure. I stayed completely still and just listened. The rain was still coming down, louder now as it hit the plastic over me. I could hear something else underneath it, a wet, dragging sound. Then another crack. I knew the forest had animals. I'd seen deer and raccoons out here plenty of times. I wasn't scared of them, but the way this moved, it wasn't skittish. It didn't run. It didn't make quick movements like a deer bounding through brush. It was deliberate, heavy. I had a small hatchet I kept next to my bag. Not for protection, really, just for chopping firewood. I slid my hand slowly to it, careful not to make any noise. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then there was silence. The dragging sound stopped. No more cracks, just the rain. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then I heard something scrape against the side of the wall frame. It was unmistakable. Something had brushed along the plywood I'd nailed in earlier that day. It was low, like it had crouched to pass along the outside. Then a single footstep, a squish in the mud. I stopped breathing for a second. I don't know how long I laid there like that, maybe an hour. The rain kept coming. The plastic above me sagged with water. Occasionally a gust of wind would blow through and make the tarp flap, and every time I thought it was footsteps. Eventually, the sound of the rain started to dull a little. I could see light beginning to filter through the clouds. Morning. I didn't sleep again. I just laid there with the hatchet in my hand until the sun finally broke through. When I sat up, everything was wet. The inside of my bag, my socks, the tools, everything. But I didn't care. I just needed to get up and look around. I walked the edge of the cabin frame and saw it, muddy footprints. Human, barefoot, leading around the far side of the structure and into the woods. They were wide and long, maybe size 12 or bigger. I followed them for a few steps but stopped when they disappeared into thicker undergrowth. No shoe prints, just bare feet deep in the wet soil. I was alone out there, 10 acres. Nobody else knew I was here. I packed up everything I could carry, shoved it into the truck, and left without touching the cabin. The hammer I'd left on a log was missing. I didn't go back the next weekend, or the one after that. I stayed home, checked online for any news. Escaped convicts, hikers gone missing. Anything. Nothing. It was just empty forest and a half-built cabin. By November, I decided to go back. Not to keep building, just to see. It had rained a few more times by then. I didn't expect to find anything left. But when I got there, something had changed. The plastic sheeting was gone, ripped clean off. The frame looked like it had been moved. Boards were shifted, one wall was knocked over. But there weren't any signs of a storm strong enough to do that. The pallets I had stored to use as flooring were scattered into the woods, like someone had kicked them. I checked for prints, but the ground was dry by then. Nothing. That night, I stayed in the truck, locked, hatchet next to me, didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I decided to take everything I could and burn the rest. I loaded up the tools and leftover wood, then set fire to the broken wall frames using some diesel I had brought for the generator I never got to use. I stood there until the flames burned down to coals. It smelled like pine and melted plastic. I watched it all turn black and fall in on itself. Whatever had been out there, I didn't want to give it shelter again. I sold the land 3 months later to a retired guy from Louisiana. He said he wanted to build a hunting shack on it. I didn't tell him what happened. I was 34 the year I decided to take some time away from everything and stay in a remote cabin for a week. It was 2019, around late September, just before the weather in northern Michigan really started to change. My name's Patrick, and I was working as a mechanical engineer in Lansing. I had hit that kind of burnout where nothing felt worth doing anymore. I'd go to work, come home, drink a couple beers, and pass out in front of the TV. Repeat. So after my buddy Sean mentioned he knew a guy with a place up by Indian River, I asked if I could use it for a while. Sean made the call, and 2 days later I had the keys. The place wasn't fancy. In fact, it was barely a step above camping. No electricity, just a wood stove, a cot, a pump outside for water, and an outhouse about 50 yards off into the trees. It sat on a patch of land tucked deep into the woods about 6 miles from the nearest dirt road, which was already 30 minutes from town. I parked my truck where the trail got narrow and hiked in with my backpack, sleeping bag, a cooler full of simple food, and a box of supplies. I brought a hunting rifle too, just in case. Not that I planned on using it, but when you're that far out in the sticks, you feel better having something nearby. The trail was quiet, and the woods were thick with late-season leaves. The air smelled like dry pine and wet soil, that musky, earthy scent that hits you the second you get away from pavement. The cabin was smaller than I thought. It sat crooked in a patch of open ground, maybe 30 feet across. The roof was tin, the walls dark wood with old moss creeping up the edges. A rusted metal chimney poked out the top like a broken finger. Still, it had a kind of charm to it. Simple, forgotten, quiet. Inside, it was one room. The cot was in the corner, mattress sagging in the middle like someone had slept in it for 20 years. There was a wood stove in the middle with a rusty pot on top. A table sat against one wall with some empty cans, matches, and a roll of old paper towels. A small shelf above it held a dented lantern and a few plastic bowls. I dropped my stuff and opened the shutters on the two small windows. Dust swirled in the air like it hadn't been disturbed in months. I settled in fast. I stacked some logs outside, swept out the cabin with an old broom I found behind the door, and got a small fire going in the stove. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the stove, ate a cold can of beans with a spoon, then laid back on the cot with a blanket and let the quiet take over. It wasn't the kind of quiet you get in the suburbs either. It was a hollow kind of stillness. No cars, no buzz from appliances, no light from anything. Just wind through trees and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. The first couple days went by slow. I didn't do much. Read a bit, walked down to the edge of a small marsh I found a mile east, fished in the shallows, cleaned my boots. I kept to a little routine: wake up, pump some water, heat coffee on the stove, sit on the stump outside for hours. It felt like I was sinking into the land, like I was finally letting go of whatever stress I'd been carrying. On the fourth night, I started hearing things. Not strange things, just things that weren't there the first few nights, like twigs snapping more often, faint crunches in the brush when nothing should be moving. I chalked it up to animals, probably deer or raccoons. Could have been a bear if I was unlucky, though I didn't see any tracks nearby. I made sure the cooler was shut tight and pulled it inside the cabin at night. It wasn't until the fifth day that something felt off. That morning, I found footprints about 30 feet behind the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine, but they didn't line up with my boots. These prints were wider, more worn at the heel, and they came from the thicker woods and stopped behind the cabin like someone had just stood there. Watching, I stared at them a long time. They weren't fresh, maybe a few hours old, but the edges hadn't softened from wind or rain. I told myself maybe they were from before I got here. Maybe Sean's friend had come out recently and walked around. Still, I checked the rifle. Loaded, clean. I leaned it by the door that night. That evening, I didn't light the stove. I sat in the dark, just watching the trees through the front window. The sun dipped down early, and everything turned gray. I remember thinking how much I loved that fading light. It makes you focus harder. Your hearing sharpens. Every noise feels clearer, like you're waiting for something to step out from the woods. Around midnight, I heard something scrape the back of the cabin. It wasn't loud, just a single drag like wood across wood. I froze. I didn't move for 10 minutes. Then I reached slowly for the rifle. I didn't turn on my headlamp. I just sat there in the dark, listening. The wind had stopped. The forest was dead silent. I waited another hour, maybe longer. Nothing. I eventually laid down with the rifle across my chest and didn't fall asleep until just before dawn. The next morning, I found a small knife sticking out of the wall near the back corner of the cabin. Just a small folding blade, old, rusted. Someone had jabbed it into the wall about waist high. It wasn't there before. The prints from the day before were still there too. But now there were new ones. They circled the cabin. Not fast, not careless, just slow, patient walking in a circle. They ended at the back wall. No prints going away. I didn't have any cell service, and I wasn't about to leave my gear behind. So I stayed one more night, but I didn't sleep. I kept the rifle across my lap, and I sat in the corner with a clear view of both windows and the door. I didn't eat. I didn't blink much. Every sound was something. A leaf hitting the roof, a twig falling, the small scrape of a squirrel. At 2:13 in the morning, exactly that, I checked my watch. I saw a figure at the edge of the tree line. Just a shape, no light, just that movement you can feel when someone's there. I didn't move. The figure stood there for at least 10 minutes. Then it took a step forward. Another, two more. I raised the rifle. The figure stopped about 20 feet from the window. It didn't say anything. It didn't come closer. It just stood there. I didn't breathe. My trigger finger rested lightly, not squeezing, just ready. After a while, it stepped back, faded into the trees, gone. I didn't wait until morning. I packed my bag, grabbed everything I could carry, and hiked out in the dark with the rifle in one hand and a flashlight gripped tight in the other. I don't remember how many times I stopped to listen. 100 maybe. I never heard footsteps behind me, but I kept looking. I knew I was being followed. I could feel it. Something about the way the trail felt alive behind me. Like someone was just beyond the edge of the trees, walking when I walked, stopping when I stopped. I reached the truck by sunrise. I didn't stop to look back. I threw my bag in the bed, slammed the door, and drove until I saw pavement. Then I drove another hour past that. I didn't care where I went. I just needed distance. I ended up in Gaylord at a diner, hands shaking while I drank black coffee. I never told Sean what happened. I just gave him the keys back and said thanks. A month later, I went to a gun shop in town and asked about that area. One of the older guys behind the counter paused when I mentioned the woods near Indian River. He said there were old rumors, something about a man who used to live off-grid out there back in the 80s, supposedly violent, never got caught for whatever it was he did. Some people thought he died out there. Others thought he never left. I don't believe in campfire stories. I don't believe in ghosts. But I do believe there are people out there who don't want to be found. People who live different. People who watch. And I believe one of them was watching me that week. I still go camping, but never alone. Never that far off trail. And I don't sleep without something between me and the woods anymore. Something solid. Something that locks. Because sometimes, when the night's quiet enough, I still hear that one step in the brush. The one that doesn't belong. I never thought a simple weekend trip could turn into something I'd remember for the rest of my life. It was the summer of 2003, and I was 26 years old, craving some time away from the noise of the city and the endless stream of emails at the office. I'd read about an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont, somewhere off the beaten path, where the cell phone signal was weak or non-existent. The idea of a quiet weekend alone, disconnected from everything, was exactly what I needed. I packed light, just a backpack with a sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, a flashlight, and my old camera. I left my car at a small ranger station near the trailhead, knowing I'd be hiking the rest of the way. The map I printed from some obscure hiking blog was hand-drawn and barely legible, but it showed a path winding through dense forest, a place marked simply as Old Miller Cabin. Nobody else was supposed to be out there. It sounded perfect. The first few hours of hiking were peaceful. The trail was uneven, and the ground was soft with pine needles. Birds flitted overhead, and the air smelled fresh and cool, the kind of scent you only get far from civilization. Occasionally, I crossed narrow wooden bridges over small streams. The further I walked, the thicker the forest became. Trees towered above me, their trunks wide and bark rough like the skin of some ancient creature. Sunlight flickered through the leaves, casting moving patterns on the ground. About halfway there, I noticed the trail was less maintained. The undergrowth started to crowd in from the sides, with brambles and fallen branches blocking parts of the path. I had to step carefully, pushing aside vines and ducking under low-hanging branches. My boots made crunching sounds on dry twigs and leaves, and I felt completely alone, like the woods were swallowing me up. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin out slightly. The air grew still, almost too quiet, as if the forest was holding its breath. I could see a small clearing ahead, and I knew I was close. The ground here was uneven and littered with rocks and moss. Then I saw it, the cabin. It was smaller than I'd imagined. A one-room shack built from rough-cut logs that had turned dark and weathered with age. The roof sagged in places, and some shingles were missing, leaving gaps where the sky showed through. The windows were either broken or boarded up, and vines crept along the walls, wrapping the structure in a green clutch. The door hung loosely on one hinge, swinging slightly in the light breeze. I approached cautiously, my heart beating faster than I wanted to admit. The cabin gave off a heavy silence, a feeling of being forgotten for years, left to rot alone. The smell of damp wood and decayed leaves filled the air. My flashlight caught on rusted nails and splintered wood as I pushed the door open. Inside, the floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt, leaves, and dust. The air was stale, musty with the scent of rot and something I couldn't quite identify. Broken furniture lay scattered. A wooden chair on its side, a cracked table, and a metal stove in one corner, all coated in grime. The walls were blackened with what looked like old soot stains, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams like forgotten curtains. I set my backpack down and pulled out the camera. The flash bounced off the walls, casting eerie shadows that moved as I shifted. It was exactly as abandoned as I expected, but there was something else, something off. The silence wasn't peaceful. It felt like the cabin was waiting. I spent the next hour exploring every corner. In one drawer of a broken cabinet, I found old newspapers yellowed with age, dating back to the late 1950s. Most of the pages were torn or crumbled, but some headlines caught my eye. Stories about disappearances, local crimes, and rumors of a man who had lived alone in those woods. The details were vague, but the mood was unsettling. I took a few pictures and then decided to set up my sleeping area near the back wall. The floor was uneven and cold, but I spread out my sleeping bag and stove. I cooked some canned beans over the small stove, the sound of the flame crackling breaking the oppressive quiet. Outside, the forest was growing dark quickly, and I could hear the faint rustle of animals moving through the brush. As night fell, the woods became alive with sounds I wasn't used to. Twigs snapping, the distant howl of a coyote, the occasional flutter of wings. It was natural, but in the darkness, it became amplified, and every noise felt closer than it should be. I turned on my flashlight and sat quietly, watching the cabin's interior through its narrow beams. Then I noticed something unusual, a faint, scraping sound from the far side of the cabin, near one of the boarded-up windows. It was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. I froze, heart pounding. The flashlight beam swung toward the noise, but I saw nothing but the old wood and creeping vines. The scraping stopped. Silence returned. I told myself it was probably just an animal or the wind shifting something outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Hours passed and sleep was out of the question. I kept checking the door and windows, the flashlight ready in my hand. Suddenly, I heard a distinct thud, heavy, deliberate, coming from the back of the cabin. I forced myself to stand and walk toward the sound. The back door was closed, but not latched. I pushed it open slowly. Outside was pitch black except for the weak glow of my flashlight. The ground was trampled in places, as if someone or something had been walking around the cabin recently. I saw footprints, large, deep impressions in the soft earth. I followed the trail a little ways into the woods, but my nerves got the better of me. I wasn't prepared to wander into the dark forest at night. I went back inside, bolted the door with a piece of broken wood, and sat down trembling. The night was long and restless. I heard footsteps circling the cabin multiple times, soft but heavy. Something was definitely out there. Maybe a person, maybe a wild animal, but either way, I didn't want to find out. My phone was dead, no signal for miles, and my only option was to wait for dawn. At first light, The forest seemed to breathe again with normalcy. I didn't stay long. I packed quickly and took the same trail back, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The peacefulness of the woods returned with the daylight, but I knew something was still out there, watching, waiting. Weeks later, I read more about the Miller cabin online. The place had been used decades ago by a man named Carl Miller, who lived off the grid, avoiding contact with others. He disappeared one winter, and locals believed he either moved away or met some accident. There were rumors of illegal activity, strange noises heard by hikers, and people avoiding the area because it felt wrong. I never went back, but the memory of that night stayed with me. The feeling of being alone, yet not alone. The silence that spoke louder than any words, and the shadows that moved just beyond my sight. That trip was a lesson. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, but the unknown people, the isolation, and the stories left behind in forgotten places. I was 34 the year I decided to spend most of October in a cabin in northern Idaho. It was 2022. I'd taken a leave from work, something I hadn't done in a long time. The plan was to hunt mule deer for the first few weeks, maybe some elk if the timing worked out. I wanted time alone. No phone, no emails, just me, my rifle, the woods, and some peace and quiet. I was staying in an old hunting cabin that used to belong to my uncle, before he passed it down to me. It sat a few miles outside of Bonner's Ferry, tucked against the base of a low ridge with thick pines running up behind it. I got there the second week of October, right as the air started turning sharp in the mornings. The cabin was small, one room, with a narrow bed, a wood stove, an old propane fridge that didn't work anymore, and a couple of shelves loaded with dusty gear and yellowed paperbacks. No electricity.
No plumbing.
I brought in a few 5-gallon water jugs and a small solar panel rig for charging my GPS and a headlamp. I had a propane lantern too. There was a dry outhouse about 40 yards downhill from the cabin. I parked my truck about a quarter-mile away, where an old logging road curved off into a thicket, and hiked the rest of the way in with a backpack and a few plastic tubs of supplies. I kept most of my food in a bare canister out back under some rocks. The nearest neighbors were about 4 miles off. You didn't really get visitors out there unless they were lost or had a reason. I spent the first 2 days just getting things settled. I cleared out a few mouse nests, stacked firewood along the sidewall, swept the floor, and patched a hole in the roof with a bit of tarp and some nails. There was a little creek about 5 minutes from the cabin. I set a line with a few snares along a rabbit trail and made a note of where the deer were passing through in the mornings. Tracks were fresh, a few rubs on saplings. The first week passed slow and quiet. I hiked out at dawn most mornings and made my way up the ridge, keeping low and listening for movement. I saw a group of mule deer on the 5th day, but they were does. I was holding out for a buck. I shot a grouse on the way back and cooked it that night over the stove. I slept deep most nights. The cold came in strong after dark. I'd hear wind moving in the trees, sometimes branches snapping from the weight of frost. On the 8th day, I woke up just after 4 a.m. I don't know what did it. No sounds or movements. I just opened my eyes like something had switched on inside me. I got up and added wood to the stove. The metal creaked as it expanded. I checked my gear, had a granola bar and some water, and stepped outside into the dark. There was no moon, just a mess of stars overhead. The forest was dead quiet. I could hear my boots in the leaves like I was walking on paper. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, my headlamp set to red to keep my night vision. I didn't go far, just followed a game trail down behind the cabin to where the slope leveled out. I wanted to check a spot where I'd seen fresh tracks the day before. It was colder than usual. My breath hung in the air like smoke. About 20 minutes from the cabin, I found something strange. It was a pile of bones, long, narrow ones. Looked like a deer or maybe a small elk. Clean. Not picked apart, not scattered. Just a clean pile, almost like someone had arranged them. There wasn't any meat left on them. No hide either. But there were no drag marks, no signs of a kill. No blood in the dirt. Just this pile of white bones, with the skull set neatly on top. The eye sockets faced the ridge. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. My first thought was a mountain lion. But even they don't clean bones like that. I walked a slow circle around it, careful not to step too close. There were no tracks I could see. Not even mine, really. The ground was hard and dry from frost. I didn't like the feeling that came over me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like that tight, prickly sense you get when you walk into a room and something feels off but you don't know what. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the trees. The sun hadn't come up yet, but I could see a faint glow starting to spread behind the ridge. I turned and made my way back to the cabin. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those bones, why they were so clean, why they were in a pile like that. I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't like it. The next morning, I made coffee over the stove and went back out. This time, I followed a different trail uphill. I was trying to clear my head. About an hour in, I came across a stump that had been freshly cut. That alone was strange. There weren't supposed to be any loggers up this way. The stump was clean, too clean, flat and smooth like it had been done with a sharp saw. I put my glove down on it. It was cold, but dry.
No sap.
Just wood, gray and fresh. I looked around. No tracks. No sawdust either. The more I hiked around the area, the more I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. One day, I found a trail camera nailed to a tree, pointed in a strange direction. Not facing any game trails, not covering anything useful. Just pointed into thick woods. It wasn't mine. I checked it out and saw that it didn't have any brand or stickers on it. Just a black case, weathered from sun and rain. I left it there, didn't touch it, but made note of the location on my GPS. 2 days later, I found another camera, this one lower on the ridge, about 3 miles from the first. Same type.
No markings.
Also pointed into nothing. I started feeling watched. Not all the time, just sometimes, like when I was bent down tying my boot or standing still to scan the trees. It was like the hairs on the back of my neck were trying to get my attention. I kept telling myself it was just being alone, just nerves, but the feeling kept coming back. I'd been there almost 3 weeks when things started to change. One evening, I returned to the cabin after sunset and found the door cracked open. I always locked it with a hook latch from the inside and used a nail drop when I left. The nail was on the ground. The hook was still on. There were no scratches, no signs of forced entry. Just open. Inside, nothing looked out of place. My gear was where I left it. The food was untouched, but my cot looked different. The sleeping bag was unzipped. The pillow was moved. I hadn't left it that way. I sat on the floor for a long time that night with the lantern off, listening. Every time the wind moved the trees, I flinched. I kept my rifle across my lap. I don't know if I slept at all. The next morning, I went out and followed a side trail I hadn't used before, curved around the ridge and dropped into a narrow canyon. Halfway down, I found what looked like an old campsite. Not old like mine, old like forgotten. There was a tarp, shredded by weather, and an old folding chair with torn fabric. A rusted tin pot was still hanging on a stick over a dead fire pit. The ground was overgrown with moss and leaves, but I could still see the shape of where someone had once laid out gear. The strange thing was the carving on the tree. A name or part of one. Looked like it had been hacked out with a knife. Just 4 letters. Mark. Below it, a date, 2017. I didn't know anyone named Mark who'd been out here. The land technically belonged to my uncle, and I'd never seen this site before. It didn't feel like something he would have forgotten to mention. That night, I heard movement outside the cabin. It was just after midnight. I had the fire low and the lantern off. I was dozing in my sleeping bag when I heard a soft crunch, dry leaves. Then another, slow, steady. I held my breath and sat up. The sound stopped. I waited a full minute, then crawled to the door and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. Silence. Then, just as I was about to move away, I heard it again. Closer. Just one step this time. I raised the rifle and sat there in the dark, heart pounding. I didn't turn on the lantern. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Whoever it was, they didn't knock, didn't try the latch. After a few minutes, the sound faded. Another crunch farther off. Then nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I stepped out and checked around the cabin. There were faint prints in the leaves. Not boots, just indents shaped like bare feet. Long toes. Why? But they didn't make sense. Too big to be a child, too light to be a grown man. They circled the cabin once, then wandered off toward the creek. I followed them as far as I could until the trail vanished in pine needles and frost. I packed up that afternoon. I left some gear behind, stuff I didn't need, things that weren't worth carrying. I hiked out to my truck in the dark and drove until I hit a gas station south of Sandpoint. I didn't stop. I just kept going until I reached my apartment in Spokane. A few weeks later, I went back. Not to stay, just to check. I brought a buddy from work with me, someone I trusted. We found the cabin untouched, but the rabbit snares were all gone. The trail cameras were gone too. The site with the name carved in the tree was still there, but the carving had been cut off, tree bark stripped away with an axe or something. Just a raw wound in the trunk where the letters used to be. I never went back after that. Whatever I walked into out there, I don't think it was meant to be found. Some places aren't abandoned because they're forgotten. Some are just left alone for a reason. And sometimes, the scariest thing in the woods isn't a bear or a storm or getting lost. Sometimes it's knowing someone was watching you the whole time, and you never saw their face. It was late October 2011, and I was 27 years old when I decided to take some time off from work. I had been grinding through long shifts at a factory in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for 6 years, and I just needed a break from all of it. Machines humming, the smell of oil and sweat, the cold early morning drives. I told my supervisor I wanted a week, maybe 2, just to clear my head. He didn't care much either way. A guy I used to know from high school, Brent, had told me years ago about this small cabin that belonged to his grandfather. It was up near a place called Mill Creek, about an hour and a half north. He said the old man had passed away in the late 90s, and nobody in the family used the place anymore. It was still standing, tucked back in the woods behind a private dirt road, with no electricity or running water, and surrounded on 3 sides by woods. But the weird part, he told me, was that it was also right next to a forgotten cemetery. Just a small patch of slanted gravestones that went back to the 1800s. I don't think he ever stayed there himself, but I remembered the story, stuck in my head. By that fall, I was so burnt out I didn't care about much anymore. I just wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone, away from everyone and everything. So I dug up Brent's old number, asked him if the place was still there, and if it would be all right if I used it. He said nobody would care and gave me directions. He didn't ask why. I packed light, mostly canned food, some bottled water, a sleeping bag, flashlight, and extra batteries. I tossed everything in the back of my truck and drove up early one Saturday morning, with my phone off and no plans to turn it back on. The drive was peaceful at first. 2-lane roads winding through farmland, then into more wooded terrain the farther north I got. Eventually, paved roads gave way to gravel. I followed Brent's directions carefully, turning off onto a narrow dirt lane that looked barely traveled. It had no name, no sign. The trees got thick fast, and the sun slipped behind the hills earlier than I expected. After a couple of slow miles, I saw the small wooden post he told me about, a faded orange marker on the side of a stump. I pulled off there and saw the cabin through the trees. It wasn't much, just a single-story structure with a sloped roof, boards weathered gray and brown, the front porch sagging a little on one side. It looked like no one had been out there in years. The place gave off that cold, silent feeling, like it had been frozen in time. And about 30 yards to the right, downhill a bit through some overgrowth, was the graveyard. The gravestones were old, cracked, some tilted over. There were maybe 15 of them. Most of the names and dates were faded, but I could still make out a few from the 1860s and 70s. One had a lamb carved into it. Another had two names side by side, a husband and wife, maybe. There was no fence, just the stones and the moss and fallen leaves. I walked around for a while, trying to get used to the silence. I hadn't realized how loud my life had become until I was surrounded by nothing. No cars, no voices, no buzzing electronics. Just wind and the sound of leaves skimming across the ground. The inside of the cabin was dusty but dry. A narrow bed frame with no mattress. A table with two chairs. A stone fireplace and a shelf with a few old cans and glass bottles. I set up my sleeping bag on the floor near the fireplace, put my food in a box under the table, and unpacked a few basic things. I planned to read, hike a little, maybe write in my old notebook. Nothing much. I just wanted space to breathe. That first night was colder than I expected. I didn't have much wood, just some branches and twigs I collected nearby. I got a small fire going in the fireplace, just enough to warm my hands. I left the cabin door cracked open for ventilation. The sound of the fire, the flicker of it across the walls, the smell of the smoke. It all reminded me of being a kid at my uncle's hunting cabin. I fell asleep thinking about simpler times, but around midnight I woke up. Couldn't say why. I didn't hear anything at first, just that deep, pressing silence. But something felt off. I sat up and listened, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me. Then I heard it, a soft rustling outside. Not leaves in the wind, not a squirrel. Something heavier, slow and deliberate. It came from the direction of the graveyard. I stayed still. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but it didn't sound like four-legged movement. It had pauses, almost like footsteps, then silence. I sat there for a long time, straining my ears, until I finally heard it again. Closer, a shuffle maybe 10 feet from the cabin wall. I clicked off the flashlight. My fire had died down to embers, barely any light. I stayed like that, not blinking, barely breathing, until the sound finally faded back into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I found nothing.
No prints, no torn branches.
I told myself I had imagined it. I was tired, stressed, jumpy from the silence. I went for a long walk down the dirt road, and the fresh air helped calm me. By the third day, I started to get into a rhythm. I collected firewood, sat on the porch in the afternoon sun, watched the wind move through the trees. But I kept feeling watched. Not all the time, just in short flashes. Like when I'd turn my back to the woods. The feeling would pass fast, and I'd shake it off. But it came more often the longer I stayed. That night, I found something strange near the graveyard. I was walking around at dusk, letting the last bit of sunlight fade before heading in. That's when I noticed the stones had been disturbed. One of the markers that had been half buried under leaves on my first day was now fully uncovered, like someone had cleared it. There was fresh dirt around it. Another had a small stone stacked on top like a marker. I hadn't seen that before. I didn't touch anything. I just backed away and walked back to the cabin. That night, it happened again. I woke up around 2 a.m. and heard movement, closer this time. like someone stepping onto the porch. I didn't move. The old wooden boards creaked once. Then nothing. I sat up in the darkness and stayed that way for what felt like hours. Eventually, I drifted off with the flashlight clutched in my hand. The next morning, I found footprints. They were faint, but I saw them clearly. Muddy outlines near the porch steps. Human, barefoot. Too large for a child, but not huge. One step was smeared like they slipped a little in the mud. I followed them around the side of the cabin, but they faded into the underbrush. That broke something in me. I felt this heavy pressure settle into my chest. I didn't want to panic, but it felt wrong. That deep, gut-level wrong you can't shake off. I didn't have a gun with me, just a hatchet I used for wood. I spent the day collecting more wood, moving it inside, checking every window twice. I made sure nothing was missing from the cabin. Nothing had been taken, but I kept my boots on that night, and I didn't sleep. The fifth night was the worst. Sometime after midnight, I heard breathing. Not mine, just outside the window above the bed frame. Slow, steady breaths. I laid there, frozen. I didn't want to move, didn't want to let whoever it was know I was awake. I just listened. The breathing stayed there for maybe a minute. Then it moved one slow step to the side. Then another. Then silence again. I waited until sunrise before moving. That morning I packed. I stuffed everything into my bag, kicked dirt over the embers in the fireplace, and got ready to leave. But when I stepped onto the porch, there was something waiting for me. On the top step was a rabbit, dead. Its neck had been twisted sharply, and its eyes were still open. It had been placed there, not dragged or dropped, right in the center of the step. There were no footprints this time. I picked it up with a rag, carried it far into the woods, and left it near a fallen tree. I didn't look back. I drove out fast, tires throwing gravel behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the main road again. Back home, I didn't tell anyone. Not really. I said the place was too quiet, that it creeped me out. People laughed, said I'd gone soft, but I knew something wasn't right up there. A month later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the area, found an old archived article from 1986. It talked about a man named Thomas Harland who had lived in that same cabin, last known resident. He was in his 50s when he disappeared. They said he'd gone missing without a trace. No foul play ever confirmed, but the locals claimed he was strange. Always seen walking barefoot in the woods, especially around the old cemetery. Some thought he lived with no electricity by choice. Others said he just snapped after his wife died. They never found his body. I never went back. I didn't care who or what was out there. I just knew I wasn't welcome. There are some places where time doesn't move right, where people vanish and nobody really asks why. That cabin was one of them, and I'm fine with never knowing the rest. I was 29 that year. I'd been working in construction for nearly 10 years straight, barely taking any time off. It was early October of 2014, and I finally decided I needed a break before winter hit hard. A guy I worked with had mentioned his uncle had a small cabin up in the northern part of Minnesota, near the edge of Chippewa National Forest. He said it was usually empty this time of year and offered to let me use it for a week if I brought my own supplies and helped clear some brush around it while I was there. I agreed without thinking twice. It was a small A-frame cabin, maybe 30 minutes off the main road once you turned off the highway. No neighbors for miles, just dense trees, a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck, and cold air that smelled like pine needles and damp soil. It was exactly what I needed. I packed up everything I thought I'd need: tools, food, warm clothes, a backup gas can, and a .22 rifle I always took hunting. I wasn't planning on hunting, but it was habit. When I got there, the place looked just like the photos he'd shown me. old but sturdy. The roof was covered in leaves, and some of the siding was green with moss. There was a narrow path leading to a small shed, and a steel barrel with a lid for burning trash. No electricity, no running water, just a hand pump out back for water and a wood stove for heat. That was fine by me. The first 2 days were peaceful. I cut and stacked firewood, cleared fallen branches, and just sat on the small porch reading or staring into the woods. I didn't even have cell service out there, which was a good thing. It forced me to disconnect. But on the third day, things started feeling off. That morning, I woke up a little after 7, made coffee on the propane stove, and sat out front wrapped in a blanket. I heard something snap deeper in the woods, like a thick branch. I figured it was probably a deer or maybe a bear. I didn't think much of it, but I did go grab the rifle and leaned it next to the chair just in case. A few hours later, I noticed something that didn't sit right. I was walking around the back of the cabin to dump old coffee grounds when I saw boot prints near the pump. That wasn't odd on its own. I'd been back there plenty, but these weren't mine. Mine had a zigzag pattern on the sole, and these had a flat waffle-like tread. Bigger than my boots too, maybe size 12 or 13. They led in from the woods and stopped at the pump, then disappeared back into the trees on the other side. I stood there for a while, holding the dented coffee tin, just staring at those prints. I hadn't heard any engines. I hadn't seen any headlights. I was too far out for someone to just pass by. I told myself it was probably a hunter. Someone maybe using a GPS and taking a shortcut through the woods. Still, I kept the rifle close after that. That night, the temperature dropped fast. I loaded the stove and settled in with some canned chili and crackers. The windows were fogged from the inside, and the sound of the wind pushing through the trees was the only thing I could hear. Around 10 p.m., I turned in. There was no real bedroom, just a cot in the main room and a thick sleeping bag. I dozed off quickly, but woke up maybe an hour later to what I thought was the sound of footsteps crunching outside. It wasn't clear. The wind was still moving hard through the branches, and the cabin walls weren't thick. But I heard something crunch, pause, crunch again. Not fast like an animal. Slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I just lay there listening, eyes open, heart pounding. The fire had died down, and the room had gone cold. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to make a sound. I waited maybe 15 minutes like that. Nothing else happened.
No knock.
No voice, just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a branch falling or maybe a raccoon. I drifted off again but slept with the rifle across my chest. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I found prints again. Same tread, same size. This time they led right up to the front porch, circled once, then disappeared back into the woods. I checked the door, the windows, all locked, nothing broken, but whoever it was had gotten close, real close. I started thinking maybe someone was watching me. Maybe they knew I was there alone. Maybe they'd been waiting. That kind of thinking spirals fast when you're isolated. I thought about leaving, but I'd already committed to the full week. Besides, nothing had happened besides a few prints. I told myself it was probably just someone passing through. Harmless. Still, I started sleeping with the stove off so the smoke wouldn't rise, just in case someone was watching for signs of life. I kept the lights out at night too, using a flashlight only when I had to. By the 5th night, I was on edge. I barely ate, barely slept. I was sitting on the floor with my back to the wall near the cot, just listening. It was about 2 a.m. when I heard it, clear as anything. Faint metallic click, like a lock being tested. It came from the back of the cabin, near the small shed. I froze. I held my breath and didn't move. After about 30 seconds, I heard another sound, soft, like the creak of a door hinge. Not the main door. I would have recognized it. Maybe the shed door? Or the pump lid. Then silence again. No footsteps this time. No wind. Just heavy, still quiet. I I stayed like that until dawn, rifle pointed toward the window, watching for movement. The first light, I went out. My hands were shaking. I checked the shed. Nothing looked disturbed, but I noticed the lock on it. An old padlock was unlatched and hanging open. I hadn't used the shed since I got there, and I was sure I hadn't left it like that. I opened it. Inside were just a few rusted tools, some rotted firewood, and a rolled tarp. Nothing looked fresh, but someone had opened it. Someone had been standing there the night before. I packed up right then. I didn't care that I had 2 days left. I wasn't going to wait for something worse to happen. I threw everything in the truck as fast as I could. On the way out, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. About 10 miles back toward the highway, I passed a brown SUV parked on the shoulder, tucked halfway into the trees. No plates on the front, windows too tinted to see inside. Just sitting there, engine off. I didn't stop. When I finally hit the main road and got signal, I called the guy I borrowed the cabin from and told him something didn't feel right up there. He didn't say much, just thanked me for letting him know. I never found out who was out there. Never figured out if it was a drifter, a hunter, or something worse. About 3 months later, I got a call from the same coworker. He told me his uncle had gone up to the cabin after the first big snowfall and found something strange. A pile of rotting food in the shed. Some kind of makeshift bedding on the floor. Empty bottles, wrappers, even a half-burned candle. Someone had been living in there. Maybe since before I got there. That's what stuck with me. Not that someone had come by while I was there, but that they might have already been there. Maybe in the woods, maybe in the shed, watching. I never went back. I still take time off now and then, still go out to the woods sometimes. But I don't stay overnight alone anymore. Not after that. It made me realize something I hadn't thought about before. When you're that far out, no one can hear you. No one's gonna come check if something's wrong. No cops, no neighbors, no passing cars. Just you, the trees, and whatever else is out there. It wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was just a person. And that was scarier, because people don't need a reason. Sometimes they just want to watch. Sometimes they're just waiting. That week taught me a lesson I won't forget. Always trust your gut. Always leave when it starts feeling wrong. And never assume you're alone, especially when it feels like you are. I was 34 that year and burned out. I'd been working too much in the city, Manchester to be exact, and needed a weekend far from everything. No phone signal, no emails, no people. Just quiet. I found the cabin online. A guy named Ronan rented it out sometimes, and it wasn't the usual rustic but still luxurious kind of place. This one looked like an actual wooden cabin, small and plain, sitting in the middle of a narrow valley in the Yorkshire Dales. It was about 3 miles from the nearest village, Fellbrook, I think it was called, and the closest road didn't even lead all the way there. I had to park my car in a farmer's gravel patch and walk the rest, about half an hour downhill through sheep pastures and some lightwoods. It sounded perfect. The plan was simple. Get there late Friday, spend Saturday and Sunday reading, walking, maybe doing some sketching, then leave Monday morning. I brought a backpack with food, coffee, and a couple of warm jumpers. The cabin had a little stove, solar panels for light, and a rainwater tank out back.
No internet, no TV.
Exactly what I needed. I got there late Friday afternoon. The air was damp and cool, and the sky had that low, gray look that never quite goes away in early spring. Everything smelled wet soil, wood, sheep dung. The cabin sat just below a small ridge, facing a crooked stream and a half-dead tree with moss climbing its bark like fingers. It was small, a single room really. Bed, stove, one chair, a table, and a window with an old latch that didn't close all the way. I unpacked, lit the stove, made some tea, and sat on the small steps with a blanket wrapped around me. For hours, I didn't hear a single engine or see a light. No planes overhead, no dogs barking in the distance. Just wind, sheep now and then, and the groan of the trees above. I didn't sleep right away that night. I wasn't scared, I just couldn't stop thinking. It was so quiet it was almost loud. I lay awake for hours listening to the stove crackle and the roof creak when the wind picked up. Around 2 in the morning, I drifted off. The next morning was foggy. I made coffee, went out to walk along the stream for a while, then hiked up the ridge behind the cabin. At the top, you could see for miles, miles of wet, folded hills and dry stone walls. No people, no cars, just scattered sheep and the occasional crow. I sketched for a bit, trying to capture the shape of the valley, then headed back down. It wasn't until I was halfway back that I saw something strange. There was a woman, maybe 50 yards to the left of the cabin, standing between 2 trees. I stopped walking. She was far off, but I could see her clearly. She was tall and thin, maybe in her 60s, and wore what looked like an old brown coat that hung all the way to her knees. Her hair was long and gray. She just stood there, stiff, facing the cabin. At first, I thought maybe she was another hiker or someone local, but there was something off about the way she stood. Arms straight by her side, no movement at all. She didn't look around or wave or anything. She just stood and stared. I kept walking slowly, trying not to stare back. When I looked again, she was gone. I reached the cabin and looked toward the trees, but saw nothing. It had been real, I knew that much. Maybe she was some local farmer or a rambler who took a wrong turn. I tried to shake it off. Still, it stayed in the back of my mind for the rest of the day. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat by the stove longer than usual, reading, trying not to look out the window. But it was hard not to glance. That single window faced the trees, and I kept thinking I'd see that coat again, just between the trunks. I went to bed early, but woke up around 3 a.m. with a start. It was a sound that woke me, a light scraping, like something dragged across wood. I stayed still and listened. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it didn't come and go, it was steady. Scrape, pause, scrape. I sat up slowly. The sound was just outside the window. My heart was hammering. I got up as quietly as I could, stepped toward the window, and lifted the corner of the curtain just enough to peek out. There was nothing, just the mossy tree, the dark shapes of the trees beyond, and fog hanging low on the grass. I stood there a long time. The sound had stopped. Eventually, I went back to bed, but didn't really sleep again. In the morning, I checked outside. Nothing was moved. No tracks in the wet grass. I walked over to the tree. No sign anyone had been there. I forced myself to eat something and hiked along a new trail, one that looped higher up the ridge. For hours, I walked. I passed a few old stone walls, a ruined barn, and some scattered sheep. It was cloudy again, but dry. I started to feel a little better. I figured maybe I'd imagined the noise, or maybe it had just been a branch brushing against the cabin. But just after 1 p.m., as I was climbing back toward the ridge path, I saw her again. This time, she was closer, maybe 30 yards. Same coat, same stiff posture. She was standing behind one of the dry stone walls, just her upper body visible. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking toward the path I'd just come from. I crouched behind a rock and watched. She didn't move, not even her head. No phone in her hands, no backpack, nothing. She just stood there. After maybe 2 minutes, she turned and walked slowly downhill into the trees. Her arms didn't swing at her sides like normal. They stayed straight. Her steps were small and awkward, like her knees didn't bend right. I didn't follow. I waited a while, then walked back to the cabin on a different route. Back inside, I bolted the door. I sat for a long time with the stove off, just listening. I was trying to convince myself she was just an odd local or maybe had dementia and wandered out here. But that didn't explain how she kept showing up near me without making any noise. I didn't sleep that night. I kept all the lights off. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall, wrapped in the blanket, and just watched the window. At some point, I must have dozed off. I woke suddenly to a tapping sound. Not loud, gentle, repetitive. I looked at the window. There was a shape standing outside it. Not moving, just standing there. Couldn't see a face. Just the dark outline of her head and shoulders, lit only by the moonlight reflecting off the wet ground. I froze. She stood there for what felt like 10 minutes. Then, just as silently, she stepped backward and disappeared into the dark. I didn't move until the sun came up. At dawn, I packed everything. I left the cabin exactly as I found it, except for one thing. On the inside of the window, right above the latch, were 3 small fingerprints. Pale smudges. Not mine. I hiked up the trail as fast as I could. My legs were shaking the whole way. I didn't stop until I was in my car and the gravel crunched under the tires as I backed out of that farm lot. I didn't tell anyone for weeks. When I finally wrote to the guy who rented the cabin, I didn't mention her. I just said I'd cut the trip short for personal reasons. But I did some searching after. Turns out, about 10 years back, a woman had lived alone in a stone house not far from where the cabin now sits. She was known for wandering the hills and bothering hikers. People said she went strange after her husband died. She'd walk for miles in silence, always wearing the same brown coat. Her name was Elspeth. They found her one winter, frozen upright between 2 trees. No one ever lived in her house after that. Collapsed a few years later. Now, I don't believe in ghosts. I still don't. But what I saw was real. I can't explain it, but I know what I saw. I never went back. I stayed in the city after that. When I need quiet, I take walks in the park. Somewhere with people nearby. Somewhere with windows that shut tight. It was October of 2019 when I took the trip to a rented cabin near the foothills of the Kaibab National Forest in northern Arizona. I was 35 back then, single, worked a job that allowed me to do remote IT contracts, and I had gotten sick of city life in Phoenix. All the noise, the fast-paced movement, the traffic, the constant sirens. It felt like I was running in place for nothing. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere with no cell signal, somewhere I could sit for hours, maybe hike a little, cook over a fire, breathe air that hadn't passed through 20 filters. A place I could be alone. Not lonely, just alone. I found a small place through a listing that catered to hunters and photographers. It was about 2 hours northwest of Flagstaff, up a badly maintained dirt road, isolated and buried under tall pine trees and ridgelines that kept out most wind. The guy who owned it just told me how to find the key, under a flat rock near the porch, and that I could stay the weekend as long as I didn't bring more than 4 people. I didn't plan on bringing anyone. I arrived late Friday afternoon. The road there was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for my Tacoma, and the tires threw up dust that coated everything. By the time I reached the place, the sun was dipping down past the western peaks. The cabin was small, single-story, built of stained wood that had darkened with age. There were no lights outside, no motion sensors, just one dull porch bulb that I had to screw in manually. Inside was sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a small gas stove, a wood-burning heater, a twin bed in one corner, and a single window with a thick curtain that looked out toward the trees. The air inside smelled like dry pine needles and dust. There were some mouse droppings in one corner and a few spider webs in the corners of the ceiling, but nothing unlivable. I unpacked my gear, set up a small work table near the window, and heated a can of stew for dinner. That night was quiet, too quiet actually. Even though I was so far out, I kept expecting to hear something. Bugs. wind, maybe the cry of a bird. But there was nothing, just stillness. I turned off the lantern around 10 and lay in bed listening to the silence. It wasn't peaceful, it was tense, like the woods were waiting for something. I drifted off eventually, more tired than I thought. I woke up in the middle of the night, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. I didn't know why. I couldn't hear anything at first, just the thick silence again. I reached over and grabbed my flashlight, swept it across the room, then toward the window. The curtain was drawn shut, but I thought I saw something move past the bottom edge. A shadow? A flicker of something? I stared for a while, but nothing else moved. I told myself it was probably wind or a branch shifting outside. Next morning, I got up, had a protein bar and some instant coffee, and decided to go for a walk down a deer trail I'd seen off to the east of the cabin. The forest was dense, full of scrub oak, ponderosa pine, and red dirt that clung to my boots. I didn't take my phone since it had no signal anyway, just a map I printed from the online listing. The trail wound its way down a shallow slope, through a gully, and up the other side toward a ridge. I didn't see anyone, not a single soul, but I did find an old tree stand maybe half a mile in. It was rusted and half collapsed, clearly not used in years. On my way back, I noticed something that made me stop. There were boot prints in the trail, big ones, not mine, and they weren't there on my way in. I looked at the pattern and could tell they were fresh. No dust had settled in them. The odd part was that they stopped halfway down the trail, just vanished. No turn off, no break in the branches, no sign of someone stepping off. It was like the person had walked halfway, then disappeared. I looked around for a while, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. I headed back, my heart beating faster than before. That night, I locked the door, not just the knob, but the deadbolt too, and shoved a chair up against it just in case. I kept the curtain closed, but sat on the bed with the flashlight in my lap for a while. I didn't even turn on the heater. It was cold, but I didn't want any noise covering up other sounds. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I heard something outside. A crunch, soft but clear. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The steps circled the cabin once, twice, maybe more. I couldn't tell for sure how many times. Then they stopped by the window. I sat there staring at the curtain, waiting for a shape or a shadow to show through. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, then more. Finally, I heard the steps again, moving away toward the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, I checked outside.
No footprints.
Nothing in the soft dirt or pine needles. Nothing near the window. But I noticed something else. My truck. The hood had fingerprints on it. Greasy, long ones. Too wide for a woman's hand, but the fingers were longer than mine, thinner too. I wiped them off, checked the doors locked. No damage, nothing stolen. It was like someone had just leaned on it and stared into the windshield. I should have packed up and left right then. But I didn't. I told myself it was probably some backwoods hiker, maybe a hunter who got turned around. Maybe a weirdo, sure, but not dangerous. That was the lie I needed to keep going. I spent the day inside, barely eating, sitting by the window with my eyes on the tree line. That evening, just before dark, I heard a knock. Not on the door, on the back wall, just a single knock, then silence. I stood there, not moving. Then another knock. Same spot, not a fist, it didn't sound like a knuckle. More like a stick or maybe a rock, something dull. I waited, nothing followed. I didn't go outside. I didn't even open the curtain that night. I slept in short bursts, kept jerking awake from dreams I couldn't remember, always with the sense that someone was standing over me. On Sunday morning, I was done. I packed my gear, shoved it into the back seat, and got ready to go. I did one last sweep of the cabin, locking everything back the way it was, and went to start the truck. It wouldn't turn over. The battery wasn't dead. The lights came on, the dash lit up, but the engine just clicked. I tried again. Click. Again. Nothing. I lifted the hood. That's when I saw it. My battery cables were gone. Not chewed. Not frayed. Gone. Both ends had been unscrewed and taken off, and someone had stuffed dried pine needles into the engine bay. Not a lot, just enough to notice. That broke me. I got my emergency radio and tried sending out a call, but I knew the signal wouldn't reach anyone. I didn't have a satellite phone, didn't even bring a flare. Stupid, I know. So I did the only thing I could. I grabbed my pack, loaded up water and food, and started hiking back the way I came. The road was long and steep, but it was my only shot. About a mile out, I started to get the feeling I was being watched again. I kept checking over my shoulder. The woods were empty, but the sense stayed with me. Somewhere near the ridge, I found something on the ground. A dead coyote, but not from an animal attack. His neck had been broken, snapped sideways, and it had been laid out in the middle of the road, like someone had set it there for me to find. That's when I started running. I didn't stop until I saw the edge of the tree line and caught sight of the highway in the distance. When I finally made it to the shoulder, I flagged down the first car I saw, a couple in a silver SUV. I didn't say much, just told them my truck broke down back in the woods and I needed help. They took me to the ranger station about 30 minutes south. I filed a report, left out most of the details, and got a tow back to the cabin the next day with a ranger and a mechanic. When we got there, the cabin looked fine. My truck was untouched. Even the battery cables had been reattached. The pine needles were gone. I asked the mechanic if he thought someone had tampered with it. He shrugged and said it looked normal to him. I didn't argue. I just paid him to follow me back down to the highway in case it died again. I never went back. I never rented another cabin. Sometimes I dream about that knock. That slow, dull knock against the wall. I can still hear the weight of it, like something standing just feet away, listening, waiting. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a skinwalker. It was someone, person, a sick, silent person who lived in those woods, who watched the cabins, who waited until someone like me came alone. I don't tell people this story much, because there's no proof, no photo, no physical harm, just a series of things that add up to something you can't explain away. But I know what happened, and I know I'm not going back.